Hello again, students. This is Mr. Steckler from AHSP STEM, and today we are looking at video number 3, and it's lesson 1-3, properties of numbers. So some vocabulary that we'll look at are equivalent expressions, additive identity, multiplicative identity, multiplicative inverse, reciprocal, additive identity. Any number so that an additive identity is 0. And the reason that 0 is the additive identity is because if you take any number and add 0, you will get that same number. That number won't change. And the same thing happens if you take 0 plus that number, you get the same number. So in mathematics, for real numbers, for numbers, the additive identity number is 0. Because when you add 0, that number doesn't change. The additive inverse is called the opposite. And so the opposite of a number A is negative A. And the reason is because if you take, for example, the number 3, and if you add its opposite, which is negative 3, you get 0. And the same thing happens if you work with a number like negative 7. The opposite of negative 7 is 7. And if you take negative 7 plus 7, you get 0. So the additive inverse is called the opposite. And the additive identity is 0. Let's take a look at multiplication. The multiplicative identity is the number 1. Because if you take any number and multiply by 1, that number remains the same. Same thing if you take 1 and multiply by that number, it remains the same. So if we have the number 14, 14 times 1 is still 14, or 1 times 14 remains 14. So the number 1 is called the multiplicative identity. In other words, if you multiply by 1, that number does not change. Multiplicative property of 0. If you multiply any number by 0, you will get 0 all the time. 0 times any number is 0, and any number times 0 is also 0. And then the other important property is called the multiplicative inverse, which is called the reciprocal. The reciprocal. And so if we take a number, for example here, 4/5, the reciprocal of 4/5 is 5/4. And if you multiply 4/5 times 5/4, that gives you 20 over 20, which is 1. Whenever you multiply a number by its reciprocal, you will always get 1. And that's because the multiplicative inverse is the reciprocal. This question looks a lot like what we had in the previous session on the order of operations, so we're going to work it out the same way to evaluate this expression. We will do the grouping symbols first. So 10 minus 7 is a 3. And inside of the second grouping symbol, the second parentheses, 18 divided by 9 minus 1, we do the division first. So 18 divided by 9 is 2. Next up, we're going to multiply 1/3 times 3. That's a 1, and that's because of the reciprocal property. Remember that when you multiply a number and its reciprocal, the reciprocal of 3 is 1/3, you will always get 1. That's also called the multiplicative inverse property. And then we also notice that in the second grouping symbol 2 minus 1, that's simplified to 1. And now to simplify this expression, we have to multiply 4 times 1, which is a 4. Remember that the number 1 was the multiplicative identity. In other words, if you multiply any number by 1, that number remains the same because 1 is the multiplicative identity. And now finishing this off, 1 plus 4 gives us 5. So our correct answer here is letter B, the number 5. The important property that I mentioned in the previous lesson was the commutative property. The commutative property holds for both addition and multiplication. And basically what it says is that when you're adding or when you're multiplying, the order that you do it doesn't matter. So if we take 4 plus 8, that's 12. And if we take 8 plus 4, that's also 12. So since we're adding, it doesn't matter the order that we add. And the same thing happens with multiplication. 7 times 11, that result is 77. And if we take 11 times 7, that's also 77. So this commutative property only holds for addition and multiplication. And another property that we've had before in earlier math classes is called the associative property. And the associative property means that when you're adding or when you're multiplying, you can group. In other words, with parentheses, you can change the grouping symbol locations and you'll still get the same result. So as an example, if we put the grouping symbols for 3, 5, and 7 around 3 and 5, and if we add those the 3 and the 5 first, that's 8. And then 8 plus 7 is a 15. But if we were to put the grouping symbols around the 5 and the 7 and add those two first, 5 plus 7 is 12. 3 plus 12 is also 15. So we notice that the order of numbers didn't change. It still says 3, 5, 7, but what changed was the location of the parentheses. And as long as we're only adding, that's going to still be a true statement. That's the associative property of addition. And the same thing happens with multiplication. So we have the numbers 2, 6, 9. The order of the numbers is the same, but on the left side of the equals, the parentheses are around the 2 and the 6. So 2 times 6 is 12. And if we take 12 times 9, that's 108. Whereas on the right side of the equals, the parentheses are around the 6 and the 9. 6 times 9 is 54. And 2 times 54 also gives us 108. So the associative property is when the grouping symbols change their location. And it only works for addition and multiplication. All right, let's take a look at this expression again. It looks similar to what we had on the previous lesson on order of operations. 3 times 5 times 3 times 4. So using the order of operations from left to right, 3 times 5 is 15. Next, we'll take 15 times 3, which was 45. 45 times 4 is 180. Now, what happens since we're multiplying if we choose to do from right to left? So 3 times 4 is 12. And then if we take 5 times 12, that's 60. And then 3 times 60 is 180. We get the same result. And that happens because of the commutative property of multiplication. The order of multiplication does not matter because we are only multiplying. So if there would have been any other operation in here like addition or subtraction or division, then we'd have to follow the order of operations. But as long as it's pure multiplication, nothing else, then the commutative property says that the order that we multiply doesn't matter. We'll get the same answer. And that is going to complete lesson 1-3, which is properties of numbers. So we'll see you next time for lesson 1-4. Bye-bye.